Hitler is often described as a genius, a mastermind who almost conquered the world. That's the version of the story most people know, the one repeated for decades in documentaries, history channels, and countless Hollywood films. A cold, calculating strategist whose intelligence nearly reshaped civilization. But what if that version is wrong? What if most of what people believe about Hitler's intelligence is exaggerated, misunderstood, or simply not true? Because the reality is far more complicated, and in many ways, far more disturbing. His rise to power had far less to do with brilliance, and far more to do with timing, manipulation, and the failures of the people around him. So let's break this down carefully and dismantle the biggest myths one by one. Hitler was a brilliant military strategist. This is perhaps the most persistent myth surrounding the man. Early victories, like the fall of France in 1940, gave the impression of a leader with extraordinary tactical vision. But here's what most people don't realize. The plan to invade France through the Ardennes, the bold maneuver that stunned the world, wasn't Hitler's idea. It was conceived by General Erich von Manstein and refined by Heinz Guderian, two of Germany's most capable military minds. Hitler initially favored a far more predictable invasion route, essentially a rehash of World War I planning that would have likely failed. When Hitler did take direct control of military operations, the results were catastrophic. He refused to allow the Sixth Army to retreat from Stalingrad, leading to the destruction of an entire army group and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of soldiers. He micromanaged the defense of Normandy, insisting that panzer divisions couldn't move without his personal approval. And on the morning of D-Day, his staff was too afraid to wake him up. By the war's final years, his generals were openly working around his orders just to slow the collapse. The military genius label belongs to the officers who won his early victories, not to the man who overruled them into disaster. But if Hitler wasn't the strategic mastermind history remembers, then how did he rise to power in the first place? The answer might surprise you even more. Hitler clawed his way to the top through sheer intellect and willpower. The popular narrative paints his political ascent as proof of a uniquely powerful mind, a failed artist who transformed himself into the most dangerous leader in modern history through personal genius alone. The reality is far messier. Hitler's rise depended heavily on forces completely outside his control and on the miscalculations of people who underestimated him for all the wrong reasons. The Weimar Republic was already collapsing under economic devastation, political fragmentation, and public humiliation from the Treaty of Versailles. Germany was a powder keg, and virtually any charismatic demagogue could have lit the fuse. Conservative elites like Franz von Papen believed they could use Hitler as a puppet, installing him as chancellor in 1933 while keeping real power for themselves. They assumed he was too unsophisticated to outmaneuver them. That assumption proved fatal, but it wasn't Hitler's intellect that defeated them. It was their own arrogance, combined with his willingness to use violence, intimidation, and the legal loopholes of a fragile democracy. Hitler also benefited enormously from the work of people around him. Joseph Goebbels engineered the propaganda machine. Hermann Goering built political alliances with industrialists. The SA and later the SS provided the muscle. Strip away the supporting cast and the collapsing conditions of interwar Germany, and you're left with a man whose individual contribution was not genius-level strategy, but rather an almost animal instinct for exploiting fear and resentment. And speaking of that instinct, there's another myth that feeds directly into the genius narrative, one that's perhaps the most dangerous of all. Hitler was history's greatest public speaker. There's no question that his speeches had a powerful effect on crowds. Footage of his rallies shows tens of thousands of people swept up in what looks like collective hypnosis. But the effectiveness of those speeches had far less to do with rhetorical brilliance and far more to do with staging, psychology, and context. Hitler's speaking style was unusual even by the standards of his time. He would start slowly, almost awkwardly, then build to screaming emotional crescendos filled with repetition and vague promises rather than specific policy. Linguists and historians who have analyzed his speeches note that they lacked intellectual depth or logical structure. What they contained instead was raw emotional manipulation, appeals to grievance, victimhood, and national pride. More importantly, Goebbels orchestrated every detail of Hitler's public appearances: the lighting, the music, the massive flags, the carefully timed pauses, the positioning of cameras. These rallies were theatrical productions designed to overwhelm the senses before a single word was spoken. Modern analysis suggests that the audience response had as much to do with crowd psychology and spectacle as with anything Hitler actually said. Place those same speeches in a calm, well-lit room in front of a skeptical audience, and the effect would have been dramatically different. His words moved millions, yes, but calling him a rhetorical genius ignores the enormous machinery built specifically to amplify a message that was, at its core, simplistic and emotionally manipulative rather than intellectually persuasive. Now, if his speeches weren't the product of a brilliant mind, what about the common belief that he was at least an intellectual in private? Hitler was a voracious reader and deep thinker. He himself claimed to have read thousands of books, and his associates sometimes described lengthy monologues on history, architecture, and philosophy. This has led many to assume he possessed a formidable intellect hidden beneath the public persona. But the evidence tells a very different story. Hitler was largely self-educated after dropping out of secondary school. He never attended university. His reading habits, according to those who knew him closely, were highly selective and superficial. He would skim books for passages that confirmed what he already believed and discard anything that challenged his worldview. His understanding of subjects like history, science, and economics was riddled with factual errors and pseudo-scientific nonsense, including his obsession with racial theory, which had been thoroughly debunked by mainstream scientists well before the 1930s. His private conversations, recorded extensively by associates, and later compiled into collections like the Table Talk transcripts, reveal long rambling monologues rather than genuine intellectual exchange. He rarely engaged with opposing ideas and surrounded himself with people who either agreed with him or were too terrified to push back. Albert Speer, his personal architect and later armaments minister, admitted that Hitler created an environment where critical thinking was essentially impossible. Reading widely and thinking deeply are not the same thing. Hitler consumed information the way a fire consumes fuel, selectively and destructively, using fragments of knowledge to reinforce a worldview built on prejudice rather than reason. But perhaps the most consequential myth about his intelligence involves something far more specific, and it shaped the outcome of the entire war. Hitler fixed Germany's economy. This is one of the most stubborn myths in modern history. The narrative goes that Hitler inherited a broken nation, crippled by the Great Depression and unemployment, and through visionary economic policies, transformed it into a powerhouse. The Autobahn, full employment, industrial expansion. On the surface, it looked like a miracle, but scratch beneath that surface, and the picture falls apart. Much of Germany's economic recovery was already underway before Hitler took power, driven by policies initiated during the late Weimar period. Hitler's government then pursued massive deficit spending, funded by a financial instrument called Mefo bills, which were essentially secret "I owe us" that masked the true scale of Germany's debt. The entire system was designed to collapse unless sustained by conquest and plunder. Military spending consumed an enormous share of the national budget, and unemployment figures were artificially lowered by excluding women, Jews, and political opponents from the workforce statistics. The economist Hjalmar Schacht, who managed much of the early recovery, eventually resigned because he recognized the financial path was unsustainable. Hitler ignored him. The so-called economic miracle was a ticking time bomb that required perpetual expansion and war just to avoid implosion. It wasn't economic genius. It was a Ponzi scheme backed by tanks. So if he wasn't a military strategist, a self-made political prodigy, a rhetorical genius, an intellectual, or an economic visionary, then what was he? And why does the myth of his intelligence persist so stubbornly? The persistence of the genius myth serves a psychological purpose. If Hitler was an extraordinary intellect, then his rise and the horrors that followed can be framed as a once-in-a-century anomaly, something so rare and exceptional that it could never happen again. That framing is comforting. It's also dangerous. The truth is that Hitler was a man of average intelligence at best, gifted with a narrow set of skills, primarily emotional manipulation, and a ruthless willingness to exploit weakness in systems and people. His rise was made possible, not by brilliance, but by a perfect storm of economic collapse, political dysfunction, elite complacency, public desperation, and the systematic dismantling of democratic safeguards. Calling him a genius also inadvertently diminishes the responsibility of everyone who enabled him, the industrialists who funded him, the politicians who handed him power, the generals who carried out his orders, and the millions of ordinary citizens who chose to follow. Genius implies inevitability. The reality is that his ascent was preventable at nearly every stage, and it was human failure, not superhuman intellect, that allowed it to happen. The biggest myth about Hitler's intelligence isn't any single exaggeration. It's the idea that extraordinary evil requires extraordinary brains. History shows us the opposite. The most catastrophic damage is often done by deeply mediocre minds operating in systems that have lost their ability to resist. If this challenged what you thought you knew, make sure you don't miss the next video. We're going to examine another widely accepted belief, one that doesn't hold up under closer scrutiny. I'll see you there.